Why even bother?
This game had such universal praise when it came out, and I don't even know why. It won multiple Game of the Year awards in 2010. The only conclusion I can come to is that people like to jerk off David Cage. I don't think he's made a single good game. I don't think he's capable of making a good game. Everyone's got this hype boner for Detroit Become Human, but I can see past all that garbage. I won't fall for buying another David Cage game again. I know it's going to be just as terrible as Heavy Rain, and even though I haven't played it, I know Beyond Two Souls is garbage too. I can only assume it's because Heavy Rain had 30 of its $50 million budget dedicated to marketing, which no doubt bought some reviews. The alternative is that it was so radically different than anything that had come out, and people were so shocked and awestruck that we weren't getting more games like Haze that they just praised it like it was the second coming. But I think that's a lot less likely than paid reviews. I don't even really have any desire to rip into this. I'm gonna keep this video as short as possible, but man, Heavy Rain is a horrible experience. So the gameplay in Heavy Rain is my favorite thing. Slow walking around, scripted sequences, quick time events. Fantastic. Heavy Rain does something unique, which is it forces you to hold multiple buttons at a time. Depending on the buttons you're required to hold, you occasionally have to contort your hands into very uncomfortable positions, and it's easy to accidentally release a button, forcing you to do it all over again. Heavy Rain is very inconsistent in what you need to do. You can fail your way through certain sections, but others must be completed as intended. You can fail every single one of Ethan's incredibly dangerous challenges, and he just makes it back to his motel room every single time. His plot armor prevents him from dying anywhere in the game, at least until the very end. You can fail things like bandaging Ethan's wounds as Madison, and as far as I can tell, it just prevents Ethan and Madison from forming a relationship. Then you have to succeed at things like feeding the baby, escaping the car, and a few other sequences. You can't not do it. You just have to. I'd like consistency. If I can fail at everything, then let me fail at everything. If you let me fail some things, but others I have to pass, it feels really obnoxious when I fail them only to have to repeat it again. There's not even any indication of what is and isn't failable. You could sit there for hours failing and have no feedback. I basically decided early on that I was going to play everyone as a bumbling idiot to try and rip a laugh or two at the very least. As Scott, I hid while I let the robber kill the shopkeeper, and I let that random guy beat up the prostitute. I also didn't save her when the car was pushed into the water. I made Ethan fail all the challenges, except I made him kill that one guy. I made Madison drink the clearly drugged wine, but then I decided I didn't want her to die, and started playing more seriously from that point onwards. But I still only needed to half pay attention. So without further ado, my outcomes for this playthrough. Sean drowned. Ethan hung himself. FBI guy OD'd on drugs and got stuck in his little RE thing. Madison jumped out of a burning building. Scott just kind of wandered off. So I got what's considered the worst possible ending, and I'm okay with that. The characters look really, really bad, even by 2010 standards. If you're gonna make a movie game with really bland and uninteresting gameplay, you need to have at least be a graphically impressive game, or have the story be so absolutely riveting that I'm on the edge of my seat. Art style is important, and Heavy Rain is just boring as hell to look at. They could have done something interesting, like have some really out there film noir thing, but it's just a really bad looking game with really bad looking people, and everything's gray and washed out. The lip syncing is actually really, really bad. The voice acting is bland, and it's just really got nothing going for it. You know, like I said, presentation is a huge part of these movie games, and when it doesn't look good or hold up well, it's awful. You know, even Heavenly Sword, which looks terrible for the most part, at least had the decency to do some really solid facial motion capture and lip syncing for King Bohan, which still holds up really well. I don't know why Heavy Rain doesn't have that kind of attention to detail. I honestly don't know. It wasn't some budget release, it had a $20 million budget, and then another $30 million going to marketing. And I think that's why I got so much praise. It was just riding the hype train and, you know, potentially paid reviewing shills. The only way I can justify to myself why Heavy Rain got such praise is because it commits a few faux pas. Heavy Rain has a few things that are commonly considered faux pas in media. The first is clearly the idea of murdering children. At least 2 kids are directly shown dying in Heavy Rain. Ethan's son Jason, and the killer's brother in a flashback. There are also numerous children killed by the origami killer off-screen. Sean can also die during the events of Heavy Rain if you fail to solve the mystery. Tons of games either disallow children to be injured or killed, actively punish you for it, or simply eerily devoid of children, which can feel odd in games with big bustling towns and cities. So one can interpret this faux pas as being groundbreaking and cool, but it comes off as being more edgy for the sake of being edgy than anything else. If the origami killer targeted grown men as victims, would Heavy Rain have been so widely praised? If Sean was Ethan's brother instead of his son, would that have made it more impactful? Probably not, which is why I feel like Heavy Rain gets a lot of undue praise. There's also some creepy nudity with Madison in a shower, foul language, potential sex scenes, all which were still pretty edgy at this time, but now it's very much a more run-of-the-mill thing. I kind of addressed this in my Until Dawn video, but Heavy Rain is basically the kind of game where you can't lose. Doesn't matter who lives and who dies, doesn't matter your choices, you're gonna make it to the finale. You get the killer's identity regardless because he's one of your playable characters. Also, conveniently, they have plot armor, which is a good thing, because they get into by far the most action sequences of the game. There's several where they absolutely should be killed. As this character, you get into shootouts where you can't fail. You get into situations where you absolutely should be dying, but it just doesn't happen, and it feels really odd. So 2 of your characters cannot die until the very end. 2 of your characters can die, but it's so stupidly easy to avoid their deaths that it's not even really a thing. You genuinely have to try to get people to die in Heavy Rain, which is really sad. You have multiple chances to get yourself out of a situation where a character can die, and just like Until Dawn, they can only die in a very small handful of circumstances. From what I can tell, the only places Madison can die are in the surgeon's house and the burning building. FBI guy can only die in the junkyard and the nightclub. Ethan and Scott have plot armor and can't die until the end. I'm under the impression that everyone in the finale can be killed as well, but it's still only about 5 scenarios in the game where anyone can die. So it turns the game into this really unexciting walk in the park, especially for a lot of the action sequences. Obviously the most difficult thing in Heavy Rain is succeeding everything and having everyone reach the finale with knowledge of who the killer is. The characters can all figure out Sean's location independently, which means you realistically have 3 chances of getting it right and getting a catch the killer outcome and saving Sean. It just doesn't matter though, because you're always going to get the killer's reveal, with the finale just kind of being a bonus scene. If you want me to give you some gameplay section that's hard, it's definitely whenever you need to hold 3 or more buttons. The game occasionally makes your hand contort to awkward positions which are uncomfortable. It's just too damn long. I feel like a broken record because I feel like I'm saying this for the majority of the games I've done for these reviews, but length is a delicate balancing act that a lot of games get wrong. The overall pace of the game is a crawl. The interesting scenes are sandwiched between really long and boring stints that can straight up be worthless to the plot. There's so little action, and when it does happen, it has 0 intensity. The reveal is so late in the game that I was mostly apathetic to it at that point. So there are multiple storylines, but I'm just going to really summarize Ethan's and interject with other relevant plot stuff from the other characters. The game starts out with you playing as Ethan, doing the most everyday things possible, like taking a morning piss and neglecting your family. Ethan takes his son Jason to the mall. Ethan continues to neglect his family and his idiot son wanders off. Ethan panics because he has some anxiety disorder and eventually finds Jason on the other side of a street and yells for him. Jason never learned to look both ways and runs straight into the path of a fucking car. Ethan dives to protect Jason, but he ends up dead and Ethan goes into a coma apparently. Then the game jumps forward 2 years. Ethan's divorced his wife and she took everything from him and now he's living in some dumpy apartment. Ethan continues to neglect his other son, but decides to take him to a park. Ethan has a blackout and his son is abducted by the origami killer. Ethan is then goaded on by the killer to complete challenges, which when completed will give him details on his son's whereabouts. Scott Shelby basically just goes and talks to previous victims' families in an effort to find the killer. FBI guy is terrible at his job and the police chief just assumes that Ethan is the killer because of his blackouts. Madison seems like she stumbles along the killer's mother by sheer dumb luck and finds out the killer's identity. Now it'll be different depending on some circumstances in your playthroughs, but these are the outcomes I got. Ethan was arrested twice and ends up hanging himself in jail. FBI guy OD'd on fictitious drugs and got duplicated in his AI VR RE thing. Madison jumped out of a burning building like a dumbass. Scott Shelby just kinda wanders off. I said this in my Until Dawn video, but most whodunits won't have the killer be some random guy. It's usually someone directly involved in the story, most likely a player character. Of the 4 characters, we can immediately remove FBI guy from the equation. He's from out of town, so it's clearly safe to discount him. They throw the red herring of him letting Ethan go, which is something that the killer would do, but like I said, he's from out of town, so it's clearly not him. Same kind of thing goes for Madison. She's seemingly from out of town as well, and she's a journalist, so that's likely that she's not the killer. So that immediately narrows us down to 2, Ethan and Scott. Ethan is clearly the red herring. He's constantly having unexplained blackouts, which are obviously meant to make you think he's capable of being the killer. You know, the police are constantly after him, assuming he's the killer. But why would Ethan be doing the challenges if he was the killer? Why would he target his son? Lots of questions. But then we've got our final character. Scott is clearly the killer. If you've watched a single episode of Criminal Minds, you'll know that serial killers try and inject themselves into their victims' lives. Scott is the only one that interacts with victims of the killer outside of Madison, and she only interacts with Ethan by coincidence, because they're staying at the same motel room. He's also investigating evidence of the killer, which you find out is to cover his tracks, not to actually investigate. The worst part is I don't actually mind how the reveal is handled. The flashback, followed by the scene with Scott burning all the evidence that's been collected, is actually a really nice revelation, and it's well done. It's really just too bad that it was after 7 hours of drivel. I'll address this here, but the game also has the gall to straight up lie to you during the scene when you're investigating the typewriter. You're very clearly shown Scott going to the washroom, then running back to find that the shopkeeper was killed, presumably by the origami killer. Then, after the reveal, you're shown the scene again, and Scott is clearly murdering the guy. That's just straight up bullshit. There's no other way around it. There's really no entertainment value here, at least not as a game. Heavy Rain is a really slow, really boring, 8-hour mystery whose entire runtime is boring and dumb QuickTime events. The story isn't horrible, but it needed a lot of the fat cut. You're often wondering why you're doing things, and a lot of the sequences just seem completely worthless to actually figuring out who the killer is. Some sections, like the investigation sections as FBI guy, take forever and are never fun. There's rarely any tension in the action sequences because you're given so many chances to avoid the handful of deaths in the game. You'd honestly probably have to physically leave the room for your characters to die. The gameplay is entirely QuickTime events. They aren't fun or engaging in any way. Even role-playing as a bunch of bunglers, I cracked maybe 1 or 2 smiles throughout the course of the game. If you're really interested in the story, just watch a Let's Play or stream without commentary and it's the same experience. You will be really bored though, because the game has terrible pacing. Thinking about it now, someone's probably done like an edit where they've cut down to most of the good stuff, so look for that. Try to find someone who's got that. 4 characters is just too many, at least in the way that Heavy Rain used them. FBI guy, in my opinion, is worthless. Easily the most uninteresting character that doesn't really add anything. The silly little AI, VR, RE thing that he's got going on is dumb. A lot of the game just feels worthless. You could really have hunkered down and focused on Ethan's challenges. You know, Madison or FBI guy's investigations, but not both. Instead, it's just split up with 2 additional characters that really bloats the runtime and doesn't really add anything. You've got 2 characters investigating, 1 character being involved with the killer's challenges, which are probably the most interesting part, and 1 character who's interacting with the previous victims' families. Otherwise, I think Heavy Rain is just fundamentally broken. I'd basically want to rework it from the ground up. You know, make it have actual gameplay. You know, it's ridiculous. You can't move around traditionally with a stick like you would. You gotta hold like R2 and then you change direction. It's just stupid. Like, it was a horrible design decision. You know, I'd like to actually have some semblance of control. You know, when Ethan's driving down the wrong side of the highway, gee, I don't know, maybe let me drive the car? Instead you get the option to swerve left or right. And that's really boring. You know, let me navigate the electric fence grid myself with maybe like the electricity going off in a timer. But instead I just gotta hold 3 buttons until I get through. You know, let me physically aim and shoot guys with the gun. Like, that's just basic stuff. I like Heavy Rain conceptually. I think the idea of a mystery that a few people are trying to solve independently is actually not a bad idea. Heavy Rain just fails in that execution. I don't know, I just don't get it. I don't know why this game has such praise when it's so boring and it has such bad gameplay, and the story is just not enough to carry that. I think Heavy Rain is terrible. Movie games need to be more like movies. They need to have a really tight story that's been gone over with a fine-tooth comb to remove any fluff. Heavy Rain is just too unfocused and too long. 4 character perspectives are too many. You could easily have cut at least one, most likely the FBI guy or Madison, or just merge them into a single character. Take the best scenes of FBI guy and the best scenes of Madison, and just cut out all the bad ones. It's just terrible. The only part I really liked was the killer's reveal, but that payoff wasn't enough to justify the huge amount of build-up that it took to get there. The graphics aren't good, the voice acting and lip syncing is terrible, the general production values are just really lacking, and in these movie games you need to have that. There's no meaningful gameplay, so if you're interested in the story, you can just watch someone else suffer through it on a stream or on YouTube. I wouldn't even recommend that though. I can think of better ways to spend 8 hours.
And he was dressed as a cop.